Hello and welcome to the Klassiki podcast. I'm your host, Sam Goff. Klassiki is your one-stop shop for the wide world of cinema from Eastern Europe. Subscribers gain access to our ever-evolving library of classic and contemporary films, as well as access to filmmaker interviews, video introductions, program notes, and more. You can sign up for a 7-day free trial today at klassiki.online. We've reached the end of the second season of the show. Thank you to everyone who's listened along so far. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a 5-star review or a comment on your podcast app of choice. We'll be back in 2025 with a new set of shows, bigger and better than before, and we want as many people as possible to have the chance to hear them. For the final episode of the season, I'm going to be dipping back into the ever-expanding archive of writing on the Klassiki Journal, which you can find at klassiki.online/journal. Today, I'll be reading an essay on the groundbreaking collaboration between director Mikhail Kalatozov and cameraman Sergei Urusevsky. Over just 7 years and 3 feature films, this duo turned Soviet cinema on its head with their revolutionary cinematography and depth of feeling, winning the Palme d'Or in the process. Their final film together, I Am Cuba, also helped to kickstart post-revolutionary cinema on the Caribbean island. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to find the original essay, to browse our collection of classic Soviet titles, and to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode. October 2024 marked 60 years since the premiere in Havana of one of Soviet cinema's greatest gambits. I Am Cuba, Mikhail Kalatozov's dizzying epic of revolutionary history, encapsulated the potentials and the frustrations of international co-production, signalling the end of Soviet cinema's post-Stalinist bloom, whilst helping to kickstart Cuban cinema's era of independence. More poignantly, it marked the end of the collaboration between Kalatozov and his cinematographer Sergei Urusevsky. Over just 7 years and 3 features, The Cranes Are Flying from 1957, Letter Never Sent from 1959, and then I Am Cuba, the pair had reinvented Soviet and Cuban film, kickstarting the cinematic thaw and winning the USSR's only Palme d'Or in the process. The radical visual style of their collaborations was forged in war, but celebrated life in all its freewheeling and tragic beauty. This was truly one of the great director-cinematographer partnerships. Although he is remembered now by the Russified version of his surname, Kalatozov was born to a minor noble Georgian family in Tbilisi as Mikhail Kalatozishvili. By the time he entered the National Georgia Film Studios in 1936, he had a wealth of filmmaking experience under his belt. His first major commission had come in 1930, when he directed and shot the experimental ethnographic feature Sotvos Venetia, alongside 2 avant-garde luminaries, the screenwriter Sergei Tretyakov and the editor Viktor Shklovsky. Nominally a documentary about the harsh realities of life in Ushguli, a village in the remote highland region of Svenetia, the film depicts the history of the Svan people and their quasi-medieval present as a continuum that can only be broken by the arrival of Bolshevik modernity. With his extreme close-ups, disorienting camera angles, rapid cross-cutting, and multiple points of view, Sotvos Venetia is clearly indebted to the Soviet avant-garde of Sergei Eisenstein, Dziga Vertov, and so on. But it also contains the seeds of Kalatozov's own future career. Its sweeping camera, locked in a dance with the stunning landscape, seems to presage Kalatozov's and Urusevsky's later triumphs. Its ethnographic energies and its interest in the battle between man and nature look ahead to Letter Never Sent. In the words of the scholar Michael Konieczka, Kalatozov's was a vision of the socialist project in which the primitive could never be avoided or wholly dismissed. A nominal non-fiction film, but bolstered by fictionalized and dramatized sequences, it also troubles simple definitions of both documentary and propaganda in much the same way that I Am Cuba would later do. After relocating to Russia on the eve of the Second World War, Kalatozov spent the remainder of the Stalin era directing rote genre pieces, including biopics of the Soviet aviator Valery Chkalov in 1941 and former secret police chief Felix Dzerzhinsky in 1953. Like the rest of Soviet cinema, he would soon find himself liberated by the so-called thaw, the period of cultural and social liberalization that followed Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in 1956. But Kalatozov had already made his breakthrough in 1955 when he was paired by the studio with Urusevsky for the first time on the collective farm romance The First Echelon. That film was largely forgettable, but a crucial connection had been made. Like Kalatozov, Urusevsky had been working since the 1930s. But while Kalatozov had spent the war producing propagandistic fiction features and moonlighting as a cultural attaché, Urusevsky was a frontline cameraman for the Red Army. The experience proved formative in more ways than one. Urusevsky later claimed that he developed his love and talent for handheld shooting while at war, and labelled the distinctive style of his Kalatozov collaborations as off-duty camera. A move to the prestigious Mosfilm studio in 1950 eventually brought him into contact with the director. 2 years after The First Echelon came the film that would change both their lives and the current of Soviet filmmaking, The Cranes Are Flying. Cranes Are Flying was not the first film of the thaw. The likes of Marlon Hudziev and Eldar Ryazanov had already made inroads in the preceding years, but it represented the first full blossoming of this new cinematic tendency. In style and subject matter, Soviet film was undergoing a transformation. The key word in critical circles was sincerity, shorthand for a kind of revolutionary romanticism in reaction to Stalinism's varnishing of reality. It is the task of the masters of Soviet cinema to depict life and people's emotional being in all their fullness, depth, and contradictory complexity, wrote the critic Olga Shmarova in 1953. This insistence on sincerity and interest in ordinary protagonists also informed Thaw film's treatment of the war and its lingering aftermath. Stalinist film had made little room for the brutal trauma inflicted by the war on ordinary citizens. Now, that trauma demanded recognition. The Soviet Union lost between 10 and 14% of its entire population during the conflict. 27 million dead, around 35% of all Soviet men between the ages of 20 and 50, killed in the space of 4 years. The Cranes Are Flying mined this collective trauma for melodrama without resorting to sensationalism or exploitation. The film is built around an electrifying lead performance from first-time actress Tatiana Samoylova as Veronika, who loses both her parents and then her lover Boris, played by Alexei Batalov, to the war, and is forced into an uneasy surrogate domesticity with the dead man's family. Veronika's Tolstoy-esque narrative arc was a radical departure from the secular national saints of earlier war films. Here was a protagonist whose endurance had limits, and whose concern with her own personal tragedy only gives way to a sense of collective effect in the very final moments of the film. Urusevsky captures the action, whether quiet domestic tension or terrifying air raid, with an electrifying camera. His mix of subjective and objective perspective, his ability to zoom in and pan out of crowd scenes, and his innovative use of handheld cameras helped to make unremarkable characters sing from the screen. As Soviet critic Maya Turovskaya noted, "When you leave the theatre, you don't know whether the image of Veronika owes her charm to Samoylova's talent and sincerity, or to Urusevsky's art, able to catch in the turn of a head, a momentary pose, the blink of eyelashes, the helplessness and obstinacy, the tenderness and pride of this particular woman's character." In other words, the film was a sensation, a point clarified for the world when it won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival. The Cranes Are Flying makes much of the relationship between human emotions and the natural world, The title refers to the return of the migratory birds to Moscow, a traditional marker of the arrival of spring. Kalatozov and Urusevsky pushed pathetic fallacy to its absolute limit in their follow-up, Letter Never Sent. The film reunites the duo with Samoylova, as well as screenwriter Viktor Rozov, here adapting a story by the writer Valery Osipov. The film follows a quartet of geologists, dispatched to the depths of the Siberian wilderness in search of diamonds. The titular letter, heard in voiceover, is addressed to the wife of group leader Sabinin, played by Innokenty Smoktunovsky, a babyface star of 60s Soviet film who would later go on to deliver a career-defining performance as the Prince of Denmark in a celebrated screen adaptation of Hamlet. A love triangle develops between the remaining three scientists, Tanya, played by Samoylova, and her bookish boyfriend Andrei and the brooding Sergei. It's a love triangle that teeters on the edge of explicit eroticism, unusually for Soviet cinema at the time. But this petty human drama is soon overwhelmed as a forest fire sends the group careening into the wilderness, with the second half of the film dedicated to their increasingly hopeless battle against the elements. It's here that Urusevsky comes into his own, deploying a seemingly endless array of cinematographic means to capture the primordial power that is arrayed against the group. Raging fires, rushing torrents, biting frost, all captured in wide-angle lenses and a yawning Academy aspect ratio by a camera that prowls the landscape like a predator, leaving our nominal protagonists receding into irrelevance. Letter Never Sent refashions earlier Soviet genres for the brave new world of the thaw. Stalinist film had rejoiced in narratives of adventure and conquest, in which the vast territory of the Soviet Empire submitted to Bolshevik bravado. Kalatozov's own aviation dramas can be considered in this light. Indeed, so could Sulphur's Venetia, as well as the director's 1969 Arctic Odyssey, The Red Tent. Here, though, there is none of the triumphalism of those titles. Urusevsky's work on the film was also an acknowledged influence on the great Andrei Tarkovsky, whose sophomore feature Ivan's Childhood came out 3 years later and recalls Letter Never Sent in its sinuous camera work, plus the primordial imagery of its flooded forest landscapes. A few weeks before the premiere of I Am Cuba, Nikita Khrushchev had been ousted as Premier of the Soviet Union in a move that many cite as the final nail in the coffin of the thaw era. Khrushchev's fall from favour had much to do with his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 years previously. So it's fitting that the final collaboration between Kalatozov and Urusevsky, who had done so much to advance the thaw in Soviet film, should centre on the Caribbean island. Having consolidated power since the 1959 revolution led by Castro, the Cuban state turned in earnest in the early 60s to the question of culture. With little in the way of a native tradition to call on, the Instituto Cubano del Arte y Industria Cinematográficos invited foreign luminaries, including Chris Marker and Agnes Varda, to the island to train and inspire local filmmakers. Backed by the financial might of Mosfilm Studio, I Am Cuba dwarfed all previous of these international collaborations. Kalatozov's team on the film included the Soviet poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko, who co-wrote the screenplay with the Cuban author Enrique Pineda, as well as the Cuban composer Carlos Fariñas. Across 4 vignettes that capture Cuban life on the eve of the revolution, Kalatozov and Urusevsky pushed the methods they had honed in their previous films to the edge of madness. Several scenes, the burning of a sugar crop by a desperate farmer, a nightmarish vision of American sexual predation in a pre-revolutionary nightclub, and most of all, the infamous sequence in which the funeral parade of a student protester is captured in a single mind-boggling take. These scenes push past mere technical proficiency and achieve a kind of hallucinatory intensity. Perhaps ironically, By the time the shoot began in 1963, the relationship between the USSR and Cuba had soured. Castro's government was incensed by the Soviets' reconciliatory response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, fearing that the gains of the revolution were being traded over geopolitical concerns. Kalatozov's film sits firmly with the armed struggle of the Cuban people, which may explain its less than enthusiastic reception back in Moscow. The film was lauded in Cuba and does remain a milestone in its film history, even though many Cuban filmmakers would later cite it as a symbol of the nation's need to move beyond foreign intervention in developing a truly native industry. The received story in the West is that I Am Cuba was largely quote-unquote forgotten until it was rediscovered and restored by Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Foundation in the 1990s. Now, this is standard Anglophone myopia and largely harmless, although the film's singular present-day reputation among cinephiles does somewhat elide the history of Kalatozov and Urusevsky's collaborations and the unique circumstances that produced them. But if there was history, there would be no future. After their Cuban sojourn, the pair parted ways. Kalatozov would attempt another big-budget international co-production in 1969 with The Red Tent, a dramatization of a disastrous airship mission over the Arctic, starring Sean Connery and Peter Finch. But that film feels bloated and lifeless compared to his work with Urusevsky. The director would die without completing another film in 1973. His cameraman followed a year later. That was From Cranes to Cuba, How Kalatozov and Urusevsky Reinvented Soviet Cinema, written and read by Sam Goff. You can find this and other essays, companions and watch lists on our journal at klassiki.online/journal. Make sure to check out the links in the show description to find the original essay, to browse our collection of classic Soviet titles, and to explore some of the films mentioned in this episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next year for Season 3 of the Klassiki podcast.